So our second keynote speaker of the day, Judith Batchelar, and she's somebody who has a strong career in the background of supermarkets, food, and the whole sustainability program, and has also worked a lot with government in different government bodies and environmental policies, and is a member of the Food and Drink Sector Council. Is that right? Still? Yeah. And she's best known for helping to direct the Sainsbury's brand for over 20 years, or up to 20 years, and is currently focused on food sustainability and her role as Director of Food Matters International. But she's here to help us address the rather large topic of the cost of not taking urgent action on climate change and addressing sustainability. So, Peter.
So, first of all, a bit of a warning. This isn't quite death by PowerPoint, but there is a lot on the slides. And the reason that I've put a lot on there is so that you can take those slides and use them after the event. So don't worry, I'm not going to read them out. I'm not going to go through every detail on them, but they are there to illustrate a principle, and the principle of why we need to take urgent action. And the reason we need to take urgent action is not for all the reasons that you will think, because you've just been discussing all of those reasons why you need to take urgent action. But I think you need to take urgent action as a sector before things get out of control. And what I want to do is to take you through where we are today with some food and drink examples to show you what happens when things get out of control and you don't move cohesively as a sector together. So hold that thought as we go through it. I'm also very conscious that some of you will be absolute experts on things like carbon reporting and greenhouse gas emissions and global warming potentials and half-lives of greenhouse gases, and some of you won't know anything. So I'm doing a little bit of scene setting to start so that when we start to talk about these things, we all have a common understanding of what we're talking about. So, first of all, major greenhouse gases. The slide on the left just talks about the three major ones, which are carbon dioxide, by far the biggest one, methane and nitrous oxide. That really hasn't really changed very much in terms of the makeup of those gases, but clearly there are a lot more of them. But what we do know now, which is the pie chart on the right-hand side, is that by far the biggest emitters are obviously the energy that we use and how that's generated, but also how we manage the land. So the AFOUL is agriculture, forestry and other land use. So it's the way we use the land and the way we produce our food, and by food, read drink as well. So if we don't address those three areas, how we use the land, how we produce food and drink, and how we create energy, then we really don't stand a chance of getting to net zero. So again, hold those thoughts. I show this slide because quite often there are a few myths about where in the food supply chain those things go. And this is food, it's not wine. So some of the issues around the energy it takes to make a glass bottle, some of the issues around the different forms of packaging that Janice has talked about, don't feature on there. But fundamentally, around 80% of greenhouse gas emissions occur in the agricultural part of the supply chain. Big chunk of that is the inputs. A big chunk of that in terms of food is obviously the food, all the crops that we grow to feed livestock, to consume livestock. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter what you look at, whether it's a cotton T-shirt and the cotton that's grown and the inputs into that, or whether it's a leather trainer with cotton laces and whatever it might be. Whatever you look at, it's the upstream part of the supply chain that emits the most greenhouse gas emissions. And that is pretty much, I say, universal. And that is where the problem begins, because these aren't things that you can solve on your own. These are things that you have to solve by working with your supply chain partners. And so how does that get talked about? And I don't know, quick show of hands, who knows about scope 1, 2 and 3? Brilliant. I asked this at a baker's conference and 3 people in a room of about 500 put their hands up, but scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, Clearly, as a business, you will be measuring your scope 1 and 2. That's pretty straightforward. Getting hold of scope 3 emissions requires you getting hold of the scope 1 and 2 emissions of all of your supply chain partners. And I think that's the bit that is quite interesting in all of this, is your scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2, and my scope 1 and 2 is your scope 3. So how do you make sure that you are all measuring your scope 1 and 2 accurately, using the same metrics, the same emissions databases, you're using the same currency and the same methodologies? Because if you're not, you haven't got a hope in hell of creating a life cycle analysis and a level playing field set of greenhouse gas emissions that mean that you can compare one supply chain to another supply chain, and that customers can compare one product to another product accurately, consistently, and fairly. So that's the first warning, because that's what the food system has failed to do. And I'll come on to say what we're going to do about that. So what can we do about it? Well, you need to understand our supply chains better than ever before. And what you quickly find out when you go to look at your supply chains is they aren't actually supply chains, they're supply networks. There's nothing linear about them at all. They've got all sorts of things going off at all sorts of angles, and it's absolute network of intrigue. But for me, the real thing here is there are things that you can deal with on your own as a business, and there are things that you can only deal with by working with others. And we've heard very articulately just now about working in a catchment area, a region, and working collaboratively, sharing best practice, and moving together in a cohesive, aligned way, and the power of that. We need loads of that in bucket loads, so thank you. We've got some things to help us. So UN, International Sustainability Standards Board create all sorts of things, one of which is the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol. And you'd think, yes, that's fine, because we'll tick the box on the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol and we know how to report on these things. But it doesn't give detailed sector guidance. So it doesn't give you the real detail on what that means for, well, actually, the difference between reporting on spirits production or wine production or drinks more generally. It's very, very top level. So whilst you might be reporting consistently towards the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol, doesn't mean to say that everybody who's reporting on their drinks business is reporting in the same way. So opportunity number one to do something differently, and do go and read it. There is then the difference between what you're required to do by law and mandatory reporting. And some of you will be working for businesses that are big enough that you're covered by mandatory reporting. And in that case, it's very clear what you have to do when you're reporting on your emissions. But of course, a lot of this is small businesses, and the businesses that you're working with won't be big enough to have to report legally on this. They will be reporting voluntarily or probably not reporting at all, in which case you've got nothing to compare. And when you're saying, actually, I need to calculate my scope 3 upstream, the scope 1 and 2s that you're going to be asking for from those smaller suppliers will just not exist. And therefore, you have to use very rough averages, which is not very helpful. And on top of all of that, and I thought it was quite interesting, we talked about certification, and we talked about the fact that, FSC timber, and it's certified, and therefore it's all okay. Going forward, that is not going to be good enough. So even though you think you might know your supply chains well, and they are certified, and they might be certified organic, they might be certified as deforestation free, they might be certified as sustainable from a human rights point of view and certificated in that way. From now on, literally from May this year, there is a thing called the EU Due Diligence Directive that said says it's not just enough to report on these things. You have to put the checks and balances in place and to show that you have basically taken a diligent approach and checked all the things that you possibly can be to make sure that what your supply chain partners are telling you is accurate and true. And again, how do you do that? Where does the best due diligence come in? So lots of people investing here in technology. So the due diligence that comes from digital supply chains. So a lot of businesses basically taking data and using that as the supply chain to flow that information through. That requires a high level of trust if your supply chain partners are going to share all their data with you digitally so that it can be verified, whether that's mass balance or other data points. But also things like geospatial technologies, Earth observation technologies that can look at what's happening on the land, can look at what's happening from a deforestation point of view or a soil health point of view even. So hold that thought in mind because that's going to be really key. And then we've got a whole load of things around voluntary reporting. And depending on where you are in the supply chain, so anybody supplying a UK retailer right now, and our UK retailers in the room, every single one of them will be asking for something slightly different. And not only personally for them, but also their suppliers in turn will all be asking for something slightly different. And that means there are an unbelievable number of permutations and variations of the truth. And that is not helpful. So one of the things that this is around climate, but one of the things that we're working on with UK Research and Innovation, where I work in the Natural Environment Research Council, we're working on nature reporting. So what comes next after climate and getting these standards in place. And one of the things that's come back from all of the stakeholders is please don't let happen to nature reporting what has happened to carbon reporting, because we will boil the ocean trying to report on all these things and potentially be none the wiser because everybody's doing something slightly different and it is not a level playing field. And I say this to all of you because you are not at that stage yet. So you have the opportunity not to fall into these traps of multiple reporting. But I realise that's easy to say and very difficult to do when your customers are asking you for things. But that is an opportunity for you as a collective to think about how you might go about this.
Stand corner.
Oh, go on, get it. We can all talk to them. Yeah. I think the other thing about all of this is that essentially, and its certification is a classic of this, is that a lot of the things you think the detail is there and it isn't. And that can be quite disappointing when you start to lift the lid on some of these things. They're not quite as rigorous as you thought they were. So you've got all of these multiple initiatives, different stakeholders, different things. That happens at a global level. So what the UN and people are reporting on UN SDGs, what's happening at an EU level, what's happening at a UK level, and even within UK, what is happening at a devolved governments level in what you're expected to report on, which is not helpful. So we want to avoid it at all costs. The other thing about all of this is there is one thing, what the things you are required to report on, it's an entirely different matter altogether, actually using that information to make day-to-day management decisions. And one, I think of my old world, most of this reporting falls to the finance teams. It's legally required. They are required to do it, and they do it just like they do everything else. And you'll get a Deloitte or a PwC or your auditor helping you prepare these reports. And they become a once a year, and if you're lucky, twice a year event. But they don't make their way at all to the teams who are making decisions on a daily basis. So the key here is how do you turn this reporting into management information that people can make decisions on. So I give you a good example. Jancis talked about packaging. So you'll all know about EPR, or whatever will happen to EPR. EPR is there for good reasons, to build a recycling infrastructure so that we can recycle the packaging that we place upon the market. We know there's all sorts of challenges around that. But fundamentally, that is the Treasury Department of a company. It's a tax reporting burden. And if we're not careful, that stays as a tax reporting burden where we just basically record the amount of packaging, the type of packaging, the recyclability of that packaging. But we don't use that to make a day-to-day decision about whether we choose that bottle of wine that has been lightweighted, glass lightweighted, or that bottle, because that information isn't readily available. And therefore, second thought about how do we make sure that the relevant information is available as management business insights, not as a annual or half-yearly report. I've put up there the framework for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, because it is everything that your finance teams will be familiar with. So it's what's the governance structure for reporting, what's your risk management process in place, and what are your data and metrics for this. But the important thing is, how do those three things, governance, risk, and metrics and reporting, drive your strategy? And again, it's the last bit, driving your future strategy, that doesn't happen. Do the reporting bit, do the risk management process, tick the box on TCFD, and then, well, what is our strategy? And there's a gap. So again, thinking about how that do, and there's some really good, nice free information on accounting for sustainability, and the links are all in the slides. So if you want to go and have a look at these things. What is government doing about this? So one of the things I do is I work with DEFRA on a thing called the Food Data Transparency Partnership. And the FDTP is basically been put in place to try and remedy these things. So how do we set data standards? So working with BSI and ISO in saying, what is the definition of this? So it's clearly defined. What are the data formats? Because a lot of people have their data in different formats, and therefore that data is not interoperable. And we need the data to be able to flow along supply chains, so it needs to be interoperable. Data emissions databases are really poor. Has anybody here had to do a carbon calculation for their business? Yeah, I mean, they're not great, are they? And there's secondary data. Some of that data is really old, and most of that data hasn't come from business. Most of that data has come from academic studies that have been peer reviewed, and hence they make their way into the emissions database. So we have a big challenge in the reality of those emissions databases. Carbon calculators, we know all about carbon calculators. Pick your calculator, pick your number. And lots of work going on the harmonisation of those methodologies, so it doesn't matter what calculator you use, get the same answer. Or Scope 3, what's in and out of Scope 3? Where does it end? Where does it start? Does it start at agricultural inputs? Does it end in the consumer's home, or does it end with the retailer? We haven't actually defined what is in scope of Scope 3, and that itself is a challenge. I talked about the interoperability, and then the biggest issue in all of this, and again, this is something where you could potentially agree how you might want to tackle these things, is the whole issue about data governance, data trust, and how that data is shared. And I suppose the exam question here in all of this, from a data point of view, is how do you make it easy for people to collect the data in the first place? Because a lot of that can be automated, a lot of that can be less labour intensive than it currently is. How do you make it easy for people to collect that data? How do you make it easy for people to share that data? And then how do you make it easy for people to see the value in doing that? Because there has to be value in doing it. Otherwise, it's just a really painful exercise. And there is huge value in it, but you don't know until you start to collect it, you share it, you get those amazing insights, and then you know where to put your efforts. So there is a leap of faith in all of this, but creating that safe data space. So in the food side of this and farming side, they've created a thing called Farm Data Principles, which companies are signing up to. The government have created in the Department of Business and Trade a thing called the Smart Data Council, and they'll be looking at how you create these trusted data sharing environments, but absolutely fundamental. Otherwise, I say, we will be measuring everything, not just in different currency, but we'll be talking in a different language as well. So not helpful. So where does all this lead us? This leads us to the place that we've got some fundamental work to do as a sector together. But we've got two challenges. While we're doing all of this structural stuff that we need to do to move the sector on, we've got to deal with all of the unpredictable change that's coming. There's a lovely saying that the bit on the right-hand side is that we've got this, extreme weather events, all the things. Think about Hurricane Milton. There's going to be more of those. We don't know where they're going to be, what time of year, the intensity of them. And what's called the ETBS, so the expected time between surprises, is going down. And at the same time of dealing with those things, which is about mitigation and it's about incident management, actually, to be truthful. How good are you at managing those incidents? How good are you at mitigating those issues? And at the same time, driving structural change. And if you want to drive structural systemic change, you have to have the system in the room. And the question is, who is your system? How far does it go? How big is that system? And how are you going to get your arms around it? Lots of academic talk on this. So if you go onto any the Agri-Food Network Plus and just put in systems thinking, it'll give you a whole load of different academic theories. But essentially, it is everything, everywhere, all at once. And that is what you are going to have to do as a sector. And think about how you self-organise to do those things. Because there is a legal minimum to take on this. So you can do just exactly what the government asks on mandatory reporting. You can do what you need to do from a EU due diligence directive. You can do what you need to do from an EU deforestation regulation or UN SDG reporting. You can do all of those things, but it's not going to get you anywhere. The box in the middle I've called industry average, and I put that there because that's kind of where the sector sort of comes together and hovers. And it's normally a bit more than the legal minimum, but it's not really out there pushing the boundaries. But that industry average takes time. And in fact, we were just talking just now about nutrition labelling. And I'm old enough to remember when there was no nutrition labelling on foods in the 1980s. And in 1991, it came in and it was, 5, and then it was 7, and then sodium became salt, and anyway, went on. But it wasn't until 2015 that nutrition labelling became regulation under the Food Information Regulations. So it took 24 years for us to get from voluntary labelling to mandatory controlled labelling. We don't have 24 years to sort this out because the game will be well over by then. So how do we self-organise to mean that box in the middle goes as far as it needs to go, ahead of legislation, ahead of what we're being asked to do, and that you go together, because sectors need to move as a whole. Sectors can't move independently. That doesn't stop you on the far right, the higher ground, those people who want to go the extra mile. But you need to go far, you need to go together. And that for me will be the challenge that I'd like to leave you with. So I hope that was helpful. I realise it was a lot, but I don't want you to make some of the same mistakes that we've made in the food side of all of this, because they are things that can easily be avoided. But it does require you to work differently together. And it does require you to think about what you want to do as a sector versus what you want to do as an individual company in the competitive space. So thank you.